My husband locked me in the basement and said, "I have a secret, and a lot of panties." What started as a strange argument turned into something much more complicated. One evening, my husband asked me to come with him to the basement. He said he needed to show me something important. The moment we stepped inside, the door clicked shut behind us. Before I could react, he locked it. Then he leaned close and whispered something that made my stomach twist. "I have a secret, and a lot of panties." At first, I thought he was joking. But as he walked deeper into the dim basement, opening an old storage trunk, I realized there were things about the man I married that I had never truly understood. And whatever he was hiding down there wasn't dangerous. It was vulnerable, complicated, and had been eating away at him for years. If this story helps you understand that honesty requires courage, please like and subscribe. There are moments when someone you love reveals themselves to be carrying weight you never knew existed. When years of hiding and shame come to surface in confession that's awkward and terrifying for them, and confusing for you. When the foundation of what you thought you understood about your partner shifts to accommodate truth they've been too afraid to share. The evening my husband Daniel asked me to come to the basement with him, when he locked the door behind us and told me he had secret he needed to explain before I could leave, when he opened storage trunk and showed me collection of women's underwear he'd been keeping hidden for our entire marriage, I experienced that kind of fundamental recalibration of understanding. Not about danger or betrayal in ways I'd initially feared when he'd locked the door, but about vulnerability and identity and the complicated reasons people hide parts of themselves even from people they love. My name is Rachel Morrison, and I'm 38 years old. I'd been married to Daniel for 14 years when he finally told me the truth about something he'd been hiding since before we'd met. 14 years during which he'd apparently been carrying shame and fear about aspect of himself he didn't know how to explain or how to integrate into our marriage. Daniel was 40, worked as project manager for construction company, was generally good husband who was loving and reliable, even if he sometimes seemed emotionally distant or preoccupied in ways I'd attributed to work stress or to natural evolution of long-term relationship. The evening that would change everything had started with Daniel being unusually nervous and withdrawn, had included him asking me several times if I trusted him and if I believed he loved me. Questions that had seemed odd but not alarming until he'd asked me to come to the basement with him because he needed to show me something important. I'd followed him down, had been confused when he'd closed the door behind us and had locked it, had felt first flutter of real concern when he'd said we needed to talk, and he couldn't risk me leaving before he'd explained everything. "I need you to understand something before you react," Daniel had said, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm going to show you something that I've been hiding for our entire marriage. It's not what you might think when you first see it. I'm not having an affair. I haven't hurt anyone, but I have been keeping secret from you, and I can't keep hiding it anymore." He'd walked a corner of the basement where old storage trunks sat among boxes of holiday decorations and other items we rarely accessed. He'd opened the trunk and had stepped back, gesturing for me to look inside. What I'd seen had been dozens of pairs of women's underwear, various styles and sizes and colors, neatly organized in the trunk, clearly not thrown in randomly, but carefully maintained collection. My first reaction had been confusion, followed by suspicion about what this meant. "Whose are these?" I'd asked, my mind immediately going to possibility of affair or of something darker, of collection that represented other women or victims or betrayals I couldn't immediately understand. "They're mine," Daniel had said quietly. "Not mine like I own them for someone else. Mine like I wear them. I've been buying women's underwear and wearing it since I was teenager. I kept doing it after we got married. I would buy pairs supposedly for you. I'd tell you I was getting you gifts, would ask your size, would give you some of what I bought. But I'd keep others for myself. I'd try them on when you weren't home. I've been hiding this part of myself from you for 14 years because I was ashamed and scared and didn't know how to tell you." The confession had been delivered in rush of words that suggested he'd been rehearsing it, had been building toward this revelation for a long time. And suddenly everything made sense in new framework. The occasional gifts of underwear he'd give me that weren't quite my style. His knowledge of women's clothing sizes that had seemed surprisingly detailed for a man who claimed to know nothing about fashion. His need for privacy in ways I'd attributed to normal desire for alone time, but that apparently had been about hiding this aspect of himself. "Why did you lock the door?" I'd asked, still processing what he was showing me and what it meant. "Because I was afraid you'd leave before I could explain," Daniel had admitted. "I was afraid you'd see the underwear and would jump to conclusions about affairs, or about me being predator or something terrible, and you'd run before I could tell you the actual truth. I know it was wrong to lock the door. You can leave whenever you want. But I needed you to hear the whole story first." Over the next 2 hours, sitting in our basement with the door unlocked after I'd insisted Daniel couldn't trap me even for confession he thought I needed to hear, Daniel had told me the full story of something he'd been hiding, not just from me, but from everyone in his life since he'd been a young teenager, discovering that wearing women's underwear felt comfortable and right in ways he couldn't fully explain or articulate. He'd tried them on first at 14, had taken a pair from his mother's laundry out of curiosity, and had discovered that the feeling of wearing them was something he liked, something that made him feel more comfortable in his own body in ways that wearing men's underwear never had. He'd continued secretly buying and wearing women's underwear through high school and college, had always kept it completely hidden because he'd been ashamed, and because he'd feared that anyone knowing would think he was gay or transgender or perverted. When we'd met and had started dating, Daniel had temporarily stopped wearing women's underwear because he'd been afraid I'd discover it and would reject him. But the desire hadn't gone away, and eventually he'd started again, had developed a system of buying underwear supposedly for me as gifts while keeping some for himself, had been wearing women's underwear under his regular clothes for most of our marriage, while I'd been completely unaware. "I'm not transgender," Daniel explained. "I don't want to transition or to live as woman. I'm comfortable being man in every other aspect of my life. But I need to wear women's underwear to feel right in my own body. I don't fully understand why. I've tried to stop multiple times because I've been ashamed of it and because I've been afraid of what it means. But I can't. It's part of who I am." The revelation had required me to process multiple complicated feelings simultaneously. Confusion about why Daniel had hidden this for 14 years of marriage, hurt that he hadn't trusted me enough to be honest about something so fundamental. Recognition that his fear and shame about this aspect of himself had apparently been so intense that he'd felt hiding. It was safer than risking my rejection. Understanding that what he was revealing wasn't betrayal of our marriage, but rather disclosure of part of himself he'd been too afraid to share. "Why are you telling me now?" I'd asked. "What changed after 14 years of hiding this?" Daniel had explained that the hiding had become unsustainable, that living with constant fear of being discovered and constant shame about part of himself he couldn't change had been affecting his mental health and his capacity to be fully present in our marriage. He'd been in therapy for past 6 months, working on issues related to shame and authenticity. And his therapist had helped him recognize that he needed to be honest with me about this aspect of himself if our marriage was going to have foundation of real intimacy rather than being built partially on concealment and fear. The weeks following Daniel's revelation were difficult and required both of us to work through complicated feelings and to figure out what his disclosure meant for our marriage going forward. I needed to process feelings of hurt about years of deception, even as I recognized that his hiding had been motivated by fear and shame rather than by desire to deceive me. Daniel needed to work through his shame about aspect of himself he'd been taught was wrong or perverted, but that was actually just part of how he experienced his own gender and his own body. We did couples therapy to work through the trust issues his long-term concealment had created and to understand what it would mean for him to be open about his cross-dressing within our marriage. The therapy helped me understand that Daniel's wearing of women's underwear wasn't about me or about our relationship. It was about his own gender expression and his own comfort in his body, something that existed independently of our marriage, even though his hiding it had affected our relationship. What emerged through the therapy and through difficult conversations was understanding that Daniel could be open about his cross-dressing within our marriage, could wear women's underwear without hiding it from me, could integrate this part of himself into our life together rather than maintaining it as shameful secret. The integration required adjustments and boundaries. I didn't necessarily want to be involved in selecting or purchasing his underwear, didn't want this to become central focus of our relationship. Needed him to understand that while I could accept this part of him, I also needed our marriage to remain fundamentally the same in ways that mattered to me. 2 years after the evening Daniel locked me in the basement to confess his secret about wearing women's underwear. We're 40 and 42 respectively, and have rebuilt our marriage on more honest foundation than what we had when he was hiding fundamental part of himself. Daniel wears women's underwear openly now within our home, no longer maintains elaborate hiding and lying that had characterized years when he'd been too ashamed and too afraid to be honest. The cross-dressing is part of our life together, rather than being secret that creates distance between us. The revelation that Daniel had been buying underwear supposedly as gifts for me, but had actually been keeping some for himself, that he'd been trying them on and wearing them while hiding this from me, had initially felt like betrayal. But through therapy and through Daniel's willingness to be vulnerable about his shame and his fear, I'd come to understand it differently. Not as betrayal, but as someone struggling with part of themselves they'd been taught was unacceptable, doing their best to manage something they didn't fully understand while trying to maintain relationship with person they loved. What I learned from Daniel's locked door confession in our basement is that honesty requires courage, especially about aspects of ourselves we've been taught to be ashamed of. That sometimes people hide things, not because they don't trust their partners, but because they don't trust that their partners will accept parts of them they've been taught are wrong or unacceptable. That creating space for honesty requires both people being willing to work through discomfort and confusion toward understanding that's more complete and more compassionate than judgments based on shame. The decision to lock the door had been wrong. Trapping me even temporarily while he confessed had been violation of my autonomy that we'd had to work through as separate issue from the cross-dressing itself. But I understood why he'd felt desperate enough to do it. Why 14 years of hiding and shame had culminated in moment where he'd felt he needed to ensure I heard complete explanation before reacting to what he was revealing. My name is Rachel Morrison. My husband locked me in our basement and showed me trunk full of women's underwear, confessed he'd been cross-dressing secretly for our entire marriage, explained that underwear he'd supposedly been buying as gifts for me had actually been partially for himself. The revelation was shocking and initially felt like betrayal, but through therapy and difficult conversations, I came to understand it as disclosure of part of himself he'd been too ashamed and too afraid to share, aspect of his gender expression that existed independently of our relationship, even though hiding it had affected our marriage. Honesty requires courage. Creating space for that honesty requires compassion. Our marriage is stronger now built on truth than it ever was built on hiding and shame, even though the truth required both of us to work through discomfort toward understanding that's more complete than what we had before. Thank you for reading. If this story helps you understand that honesty requires courage, please like and subscribe.